Welcome to this deeply visual study. Today, we're bringing you a full summary of an absolutely fascinating discussion from the channel Events and History. And hey, if you want to dive into their original deep dive, the link is right down below. Now, let's just jump right in. I want you to picture something with me. Imagine we're walking into this dark, dusty, cavernous library, right? We pull out these incredibly fragile ancient Semitic manuscripts from the 7th century. We're talking about an era where the written word carried literal world-shaping weight. Now, imagine the ink on those pages actually starting to morph and shift right before our eyes, peeling back centuries of history. That is exactly the kind of linguistic time travel we're embarking on today. We're looking at a historical study that examines the very foundations of how ancient religious texts were recorded, transmitted, and, according to some researchers, perhaps profoundly altered over time.
What if a few tiny dots and vowel marks, added long after the earliest consonantal text, completely changed its meaning? That right there is our ultimate hook today. Think of this as a historical detective story. We're exploring an era where literally adding microscopic drops of ink to a page could alter the trajectory of one of the world's most influential texts. I mean, the ripple effects of a single dot over centuries can shape the beliefs and histories of millions of people. The source material we're summarizing features Dr. J. Smith and Islamic researcher Thomas Alexander, and they impartially unpack this highly debated linguistic theory surrounding Surah 96 of the Quran. It's going to force us to ask some massive questions about just how fragile written history really is.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Part 1, the manuscript mystery. So, to really grasp the gravity of what these researchers are digging into, we have to understand the actual mechanics of the ancient text itself. We're looking at 7th century Middle Eastern writings, which is a totally different ballgame from the printed, spell-checked books we rely on today. Back then, parchment was ridiculously expensive, and writing, it was a massive chore. So a written text was often more of a memory aid for native speakers who already knew the oral traditions by heart, rather than a standalone record. And this brings us to a crucial concept, the rasm. Basically, the rasm is the foundational consonantal text of early Arabic manuscripts. The cardinal rule here is that early Arabic and Aramaic shared the exact same fundamental letter shapes. But, and this is a huge but, originally these letters were written entirely without diacritical dots or vowel markings. You just had 14 to 16 base consonant shapes. No dots, no vowels, just the raw skeletal framework of the words. To put that into perspective, just look at the sheer ambiguity of the original Rasman text. Check out this single, simple, undotted bowl-shaped character. Depending on where you place the dots, and remember, the source notes these dots were standardized and added centuries after the original writing, this one shape can be 5 completely different letters. It could be a B, a T, a Th, an N, or a Y. Without those dots, native speakers had to rely entirely on their oral memory and the immediate context of the sentence to figure out what was being said. You can imagine how easily a word's meaning could drift or just be completely rewritten over hundreds of years if the original authors didn't lock it in with dots. Now, while some primitive marks did exist early on, that complex system of standardized dots we see today, it just wasn't there in the earliest foundational manuscripts.
Which brings us to Part 2, Gunter Luling's methodology.
This incredible ambiguity is exactly what inspired the methodology of the late German researcher Günter Lulling. The source details his highly debated approach, and what Lulling did as a linguist was ask a pretty radical question. What happens if we just ignore centuries of later commentaries, strip away all the modern dots and vowels, and look strictly at the raw original rasm? Working kind of like a forensic linguist, he developed a step-by-step process. Step 1, strip away those later diacritical marks. Step 2, analyze that raw skeletal consonant text. And Step 3, look for Aramaic cognates. This is absolutely crucial because Aramaic was the lingua franca, the common everyday language of that broader region back then. He's looking for words that share a common root in both Aramaic and early Arabic. It's basically a visual process of peeling back the historical layers. Ultimately, Lulling argues that what lies beneath the traditional text is actually a pre-Islamic Christian Arabic hymn structure.
Let's see this method in action. Part 3, Analyzing Surah 96. To really get a feel for how this works, the source material focuses on a primary case study analyzed by Thomas Alexander, specifically Surah 96, which is a relatively short but famous chapter. Here's Lulling's first major proposition, presented neutrally for our study today. In the traditional reading of verse 18, you have a word pronounced Zabaniya. Now, historically, Muslim scholars have really struggled with this word. Linguistically, it's a hapax legomenon, which is just a fancy way of saying it's a word that appears only once in the entire text.
Because there's no surrounding context for it, traditional translations generally settled on angels of hell. But watch this. Luling takes that exact same rasam, shifts the centuries later dots, and boom, it becomes Rabbaniya. By looking at the Aramaic used in the region at the time, he knows that Rabbanuni translates to Lord, Master, or Teacher, a super common cognate referring to Jesus Christ. So without changing a single underlying skeletal letter, a confusing reference to Hell's Angels cleanly translates into a recognizable regional title. Crazy, right? Let's expand on that. Part 4, Traditional versus New Reading. So we're going to put the traditional reading side by side with Luling's reconstruction so you can visually see how the entire narrative transforms just by rearranging these tiny historical dots. Let's start right at the beginning of the chapter. Traditionally, this famously translates to the solitary command, read in the name of your Lord. But Luling noticed that everywhere else in the text with a similar structure, the word actually means praise or invoke. So he translates it as invoke the name of your Lord. And guys, this represents a massive theological paradigm shift. Suddenly, we're not looking at an intimidating command spoken to an illiterate prophet alone in a cave, instructing him to read a book he can't read. Instead, it reads exactly like an instruction for a congregation to invoke the Lord's name in communal musical song. The whole emotional core of the text shifts from a solitary revelation to a public hymn. Now, what's really interesting about this next slide is how it ties into other regional traditions. The traditional text states that God created man from a clinging substance, which later historical traditions firmly interpret as a blood clot. But when Luling shifts those diacritics, the exact same base letters read, created man from clay. The source highlights how this reconstructed reading fits so much more seamlessly into the broader regional literature. I mean, clay aligns perfectly with much older, widely understood biblical Genesis traditions, and frankly, broader ancient Near Eastern creation myths, where mankind is formed directly from the dust or clay of the earth. As we move further into the text, Luling's method actually resolves some incredibly jarring imagery. The traditional reading says, "We will surely drag him by the forelock, a lying, sinning forelock." A lying forelock? The source emphasizes just how baffling this imagery of a sinning patch of hair has been for scholars over the centuries. But again, Luling simply shifts the dots, and it becomes seized by his honor, and later, call for his high counsel. This completely changes the vibe of the passage. It shifts away from this bizarre imagery of physical violence and punishment, and connects directly back to well-understood ancient Jewish and Christian customs regarding honor, counsel, and divine court imagery. According to the source, this gives the passage a logical coherence that was just totally missing before. And all of this leads us to some fascinating structural evidence, specifically the number 3. The source points out that when you read Luling's reconstructed text, you don't just get a different story, you get a completely different rhythm. His translation naturally produces 3-line rhyming stanzas. Now, why does that matter? Well, remember the oral culture of the 7th century Middle East. In a society where the vast majority of people couldn't read, rhyming stanzas were absolutely vital mnemonics, memory aids. These 3-line rhymes were heavily used by congregations to memorize lengthy Christian hymns. The traditional Arabic reading, however, completely breaks this rhyming mnemonic structure. So for Luling and the researchers, this broken rhyme scheme is basically forensic evidence. It suggests the original poetic rhythm was disrupted and lost when those standardized dots were added incorrectly centuries later. Which brings us to Part 5, Exegesis after the fact. We really need to look at the broader implications here. What actually happens to a community when the original context and meaning of their sacred text is just lost to history? This brings up exegesis, which is simply the critical interpretation of a text to understand what the author originally intended. The source proposes a huge theory here, reverse exegesis. This argument suggests that centuries later, when scholars looked at a text that no longer made sense because those standardized dots had altered the original words, they basically had to invent stories to explain the new text. Think about the famous traditional narrative of the angel Gabriel physically squeezing Muhammad in the cave of Hira, commanding him to read even though he was illiterate. The source neutrally presents Luling's counter-theory. What if this entire famous narrative is historical reverse exegesis? A story created centuries later, specifically to make sense of a congregation's hymn, to invoke, that had accidentally been dotted to command someone to read. The idea is that stories naturally arise to fill in the linguistic gaps. So, the crucial point we're getting to is Part 6, Questions of Textual Origins. What does all this textual transmission theory actually mean for historical research? Let's walk through the exact chronological timeline proposed by Luling. First up, in the pre-7th century environment,
Christian and Aramaic hymns are being orally transmitted, sung, and are super well known across the region. Then, secondly, in the 7th century, during this phase of raw documentation, these hymns are recorded in early Arabic rasm. Remember, just the consonant shapes, strictly without dots, acting purely as memory aids. Finally, in later centuries, as expanding empires push for standardization, diacritics and vowels are permanently added to the text by people who, according to the theory, had lost that original oral context. This standardized dotting profoundly altered the meaning of the words, which then required entirely new theological stories to explain them.
To summarize the key takeaways of this really dense linguistic study today, let's connect the dots, pun intended. The original skeletal rasm is highly ambiguous without those standardized dots that came later. Gunter Luling's forensic method removes the later dots to uncover earlier regional Aramaic structures. And when he applies that to Surah 96, the text morphs from a disconnected series of individual commands into a cohesive, rhyming Christian hymn about clay creation and divine high counsel. Because of this, the study challenges later oral traditions, suggesting they might just be historical reverse exegesis, entire narratives invented simply to explain a text whose original meaning got obscured by the stroke of a pen.
And that brings us to the end of our full summary today. History is just incredibly delicate, isn't it? The big picture theme we've been exploring is that entire belief systems spanning centuries and continents can sometimes hinge on the smallest, most easily misunderstood historical artifacts. So I want to leave you with this provocative question to ponder. If a few tiny dots, added centuries later, can completely reshape a sacred text, how does that change the way we read the history of the world's most influential books? Definitely something to think about. Remember to check out the full discussion from the channel Events in History linked below. Thanks for joining me on this visual deep dive into the past, and keep questioning the history laid out before you.